All right, welcome everybody. Today we're going to be going into Intro to Python. And in Intro to Python, the topics that we'll be covering will be list, tuples, dictionaries. We'll be going over Python control flow, and we'll also be going over the common built-in methods that we can use. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to understand how to find an item inside of a list, understand switch cases. Well, switch cases aren't a thing in Python, but you will understand control flow in Python. You'll understand how to construct Lambda functions and use methods like map, filter, sort, or reduce. Understand the try and except handling error handling, and understand files in Python. And okay, seems like we got stuff on the chat. Never mind, that's about ES6. All right, so lesson. We'll go ahead and move straight into some data structures. We got some primitive data structures, and there's really not that much of a difference between Python and JS, at least in my head. I try to tell myself that they're somewhat similar. The main difference is that Python is more of an angrier language than JavaScript is, meaning that there's a couple of things that you can do in JavaScript that you can't do in Python. So for example, in Python, if I were to take the string of 5 and add it to the number 5, it would actually add them together and create the string of 55, right? Whereas in Python, if I try to do that same operation, it's going to give me an error and say these two are not the same exact data type, so we can't do this. And it just returns an error and doesn't let me move forward, which I personally like, to that flexibility being taken away from me, but to each their own. So let's start with variables, since it's the most basic thing. Variables should not start with numbers, nor should they start with any type of special character in Python. The hash or the ampersand will be what we will utilize to make comments. So let's go ahead and make a small number. So small number. This is called snake casing. And in snake casing, basically stands for, can you make your VS Code text a little bit bigger? Yes, I can. Thank you. Is that better? Cool. Moving forward. So a small number. This is what snake casing is. And you guys will realize I'm trying to go a little bit faster than usual. And that's because we do have a lot of material to cover today. So snake casing just basically means that in between each word, we would have an underscore, which is opposite to what we regularly do in JavaScript, where we would use camel casing. So camel casing is for JavaScript, snake casing is for Python. All right. And then I could also do something like print the type of a small number. And when I print this, we will see that it should give me back an integer type. So it gives me class integer, meaning that it is a type of integer. So let's break that up here and we'll call this.
I just have a quick question.
Of course.
So I know you mentioned like the different like casing for like JavaScript versus Python. Is that more like a stylistic kind of best practice, or will I get an error if I do the opposite on accident or something?
Yeah, it's definitely just stylistic. But at the same time that it is stylistic, it's also the like commonality across the board. So if you go to an interview and you start doing snake casing while you're utilizing the JavaScript language, they're not necessarily going to tell you it's wrong, because it's not wrong, but it's not preferred. It goes against the standard of what everybody expects their variables to be named in JavaScript. And the same could be said vice versa when you're utilizing Python. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would just say, I don't think anyone at an interview would ever like dock you in any sense for like, you know, you prefer camel case, you prefer snake case. If it works, it works, but it's just like sort of like the Python world at large seems to prefer snake case, the JavaScript world at large seems to prefer camel case. And as Rob mentions, at a specific company, especially a big one like Google, they'll have their own style guide. They'll tell you this is how we do it. And the whole point is just that when someone reads your code, it's not unique to you. It's how everyone's code looks. And it
Just for
makes
uniformity's sake, right?
What was that?
It's just for uniformity's sake, right?
Exactly, right. So like Python could have just as well gone camel case, and JavaScript snake case. It's just that someone started a trend and it was like, well, if we want everything to look the same, let's just do it the same way. And it removes the mental burden of like learning someone else's style a little bit more.
That makes more sense.
Jesse is asking for Python, I guess, for function names. I don't even know. What is the standard for function names in Python?
In camel case for both, right? No, actually. So when you're when you're writing in Python in general, you're always going to use snake casing unless you're writing in OOP. And we'll go into OOP later on, but currently at the level that we're at, we're just going to concentrate specifically on snake casing. So when you write your variables, stick to snake casing for now. Does that answer your question, Jesse?
But for the actual function name as well.
That's correct.
Do
Function
snake, okay.
snake casing.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. So now we're going to go into strings. And here in strings, we have this greeting and we have this person. Well, if I wanted to actually check the type of these greetings in person, and actually, let me just cover this real quick. Just like in JavaScript, it doesn't matter what kind of quotation marks we use when we're using string. We could use these. But the biggest problem that I used to run into is that if I use this single quotation marks and then I try to write something like isn't, well, now we see that I get this error, and that's because I ended up closing the quotations here. I wrote a random T, so this is going to tell me that it's not defined. And then I have a new string starting here. So there's a couple of ways to fix this. I can escape the closing quotation mark by putting a backslash, or I could just simply change the single quotation mark for a double quotation mark and then take off the backslash. There's a couple of other ways to format string. So I can also say formatted string, and I probably want to rename that. And then I could do something like 3 quotation marks. And when I do those 3, we'll see that it drops. And I can actually type something like this. And now when I go to print my formatted string, or formatter string, probably want to change that as well. And I run it, I still see the questions from this print statement up here. But when I see this formatted string being printed out, it prints out exactly how I typed it in there. Let's see. Just to clarify, we can also see that the way I'm establishing variables, we don't have to worry about let, var, or const anymore. Now we can just establish variables and everything will be mutable as long as it's not inside of a tuple or if it's not a function. Is it for multi-line, I'm assuming? Are you asking about the formatter? Yes, it would be for multi-lines. How would iterating through that work? Through the formatted string?
Yeah, like, does it recognize?
Yeah, let's check it out. I actually haven't done that before, so let's see what it does. And please don't worry about the syntax here. We'll cover for loops shortly. Okay, so it looks like it recognizes all of the dead space in between each individual letter. So what it's actually doing is when I go to print, it starts off here and it highlights from here all the way up, including all of these dead space characters.
Thank you.
Of course.
Is there any other instances that we would need to escape characters for any reason?
Let's say you just wanted a new line. You could use this. Random person isn't here. Person. Yeah, so now we got random person, it ends, and then it puts here. And that's because I put the /n to start a new line. But other than that, I can't really think of a specific reason for utilizing the escape. in strings. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Sorry, my mute button was hard to find.
No, no problem at all. All right. So now we were able to cover this information, and let's see, what if I wanted to do something like interpolated string, right? So as I mentioned earlier, I can add strings together. I can say that I want to print greeting plus an empty space, and then I want to add my person as well. All right, and when I run this, I should see hello random person. And this works. I'm technically just adding string onto each other, but this is definitely not the most preferred way that I want to do this. So instead, I want to use something like interpolated string, which in JavaScript, we use backticks, the money sign, and then the curly brackets. But in Python, it's a lot simpler because all we have to utilize is the F string. The F string, we just put an F at the front, and it tells the string that I'm going to be placing individual variables inside of the string. And now I can say greeting. I leave that same empty space that I added before, and then person. And I could clear this and run this real quick so that we could see hello random person. And that covers interpolated string. We'll be going into string methods here shortly, but does everybody understand the basics of string here? Okay. Let's move on and go into Booleans. Okay. So now in Booleans are basically exactly the same. We just got true or false, right? The only main difference is that now we have to write them with a capital letter at the beginning. I used to always mess that up. I would try to write them the same as in JavaScript with lowercase letters, but this will oftentimes tell you what is correct or what isn't. We can also check what is truthy or falsy. So if I say print 0, or let's see, if I say if 0, print truthy. Sorry, I'm doing this all wrong. Num is equal to 0. Let's pass num in here.
You don't need the brackets, right?
I don't. I'm writing in JavaScript again. Print falsy. All right. So now when I run this, we see that we get falsy. So the number 0 will be falsy. And if I try to put negative numbers in there, see what this will do. Well, that gives me truthy because now it has a value. Same thing where if I change it into 2 and I run it with a positive number, it gives me truthy. So anything that isn't 0 will come back to be truthy as far as number goes, where if it is 0, it will come back to be falsy. Okay, so now let's check for string. If I pass an empty string, what do we think that would do?
So it's going to be falsy, I guess, empty string.
Yeah, it's going to be falsy. Oh, I could probably choose the right command. That's going to come out to be falsy. And if I start putting spaces here, and I run it, it comes back to be truthy. Because now it's no longer just one empty space, it's actually multiple spaces in there. And same thing if I start writing inside of it, and I run it, we still get back truthy. All right, so there's truthy and falsy with strings. And now we obviously know true or false. We already covered that yesterday, so I'm just going to go ahead and keep pushing through Booleans. Could we have in the if statement, like we do in JavaScript, You can. So when you do your if statements here, technically you can still put the parentheses around here, and nothing would necessarily change. It's still going to read the function correctly. But it's just not proper syntax. Does that answer your question, Jonathan?
It does, thank you.
Of course. All right, so let's move on to lists. Let's make this list of names and let's just grab these that we have up here. All right, so lists work exactly the same as arrays. So since they work exactly the same as arrays, and let me just format it real quick. How could I go ahead and print out cucumber out of this list of names?
By calling index.
All right, so I would want to call the index. Which index would that be?
Should be 2.
Now we see cucumber. Great. Now this is awesome. And if I wanted to go ahead and start a list within a list, how could I get watermelon out from list of names? Someone who hasn't gone yet.
Bracket 1, 1.
Okay, so at bracket 1, I believe we have tomatoes. So let me run.
Bracket 1 of 1.
4, actually, I believe it's 4, isn't it?
Say again.
Bracket 4, then another bracket 1.
Okay, let's try bracket 4 and see what it will do. Okay, so at bracket 4, it looks like we're grabbing the array and we wanted watermelon. So now we could grab bracket 1 or index 1, right? And when I run this, I get watermelon. I basically have a list inside of a list. All right, easy. So that goes list. And then here we go into tuples. And then I could put these side by side so that we can watch them change. List of companies. Let's make this a tuple. Let's have Google, Apple, Facebook. Can't really think of another one. Anybody got one off the top of
Tesla.
there you go, Tesla. Nice.
Twitter.
Say again.
Twitter.
Oh, Twitter. Okay. Awesome. So now we got these, we got both of these values, right? And we're already grabbing watermelon, but let's say that I wanted watermelon to instead be, I don't know, let's just say apples. So I'm going to do something called variable reassignment. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the list of names. I'm going to enter index 4 and then tell it that at index 1, instead of having watermelon, I want it to have apples. And I can then print out list of names. And let's just actually print index 4 so that we can see the specific part of our list. And now when I run it, we see banana, apple, and pumpkin because I changed the value of watermelon. Okay, so this worked well. But now what if I wanted to change the value of Facebook inside of my tuple? Well, one would assume that I could do the same exact thing and say that I wanted to grab Facebook, which is at index 2. And I would want to change it for, let's say, code platoon. And now let's print out the tuple of companies. And when I run this, I get this error and it's telling me that a tuple object does not support item assignment. So tuples are very specific, and so are lists. Lists have all these functionality that are built within them for us to actually be able to manipulate and alter all of the things inside of a list, while a tuple does not. So a tuple is good to utilize when you're trying to save memory space, because since a tuple doesn't support memory assignment, it doesn't utilize any extra memory when you establish a tuple, while a list uses an extensive amount of memory because it has to consider all of the things that you can possibly do with a list still. So
When you say list, do you mean array? Because I think the Python list is something else, right?
no, so this is actually what a Python list is. Arrays are the same thing as Python list. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the one where you know, things cannot repeat inside of it. Is that a I think it's in curly brackets.
Yeah, so that you're talking about a set.
Set. Okay, there it is. Sorry.
Yeah. No problem at all. And I could actually go over a set real quick. And that's actually a very useful data structure that we don't have on this list, so I might as well throw it in there. But the main thing about tuples that we need to note, and is probably going to be the question that you guys may get, is tuples are immutable, meaning it cannot be mutated, and lists are mutable, meaning you can mutate them. Again, lists are mutable. You can change the values inside of them or change their order, and tuples are immutable. Once it's established, it stays exactly in that order with those same values.
So you can't add to a tuple either, like you can't add at the end of it like an array?
No, I don't believe so. Let's try it out. Let's say tuple of commands dot count dot add. So it gives me a count index and it gives me this add function as well, but it doesn't seem like it's actually adding. It's constructing an entirely new tuple. So this is a function that would return a new value of a tuple. So I would have to assign it to a new variable. Does that answer?
Yeah, the underscore add means that it supports the addition operator.
Oh, okay.
But just like with addition with numbers, and this is generally, if you have something that's immutable and you want to grow it, the idea is you're not mutating the original thing. You're taking the original thing, you're taking another of the original thing, and you're combining them to create a new thing. So it's the distinction's kind of subtle. But
Yeah.
you can definitely grow it. You're just creating a new thing and then maybe saving it to the same variable.
Awesome. Let's see if I could somewhat mimic that, what we were just told. So if I'm saving it to the same variable, maybe I could add a tuple like this and then say Platoon. Okay, it seems it didn't like that either. Can only concatenate tuple, not string. Well, this is.
Oh yeah, that's a really subtle issue. Right, exactly. Yeah, it doesn't know that was a tuple unless you put a comma at the end. If it just has one thing in it.
Yep. Perfect. So you can add into it, but again, it's destroying this entire tuple that's originally in there. And it's making an entirely new tuple. We're just saving it to the same exact variable. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. Awesome. And then let's go into sets real quick. So now a set, why isn't this working? There you go. A set doesn't allow values to be included in there. So let's say that I wanted to do, let's say x is equal to set, and then you do the curly brackets, right? Or is it that one? I may need a refresher on the syntax for sets. Let's see.
Yes, you can start with a curly bracket without putting set. Just like dictionary.
Oh, I see. So I just started with the curly brackets? I don't think so. I think that would just start a.
It's just the curly brackets. Yeah, it's just curly brackets. If you want to make a dictionary, you have to specify it's a dictionary, I believe.
I believe you guys. I just want to check it real quick. Okay, there it is. So if I wanted to start an empty set, I can say set and then call it this way. And then let's say that I have a string with multiple characters, and then I get told, hey, make sure that this string has no repeated characters. So let's say 30 string. And then I make that to a bunch of repeated characters. Okay, well, now what I'm going to do is I can iterate. So for letter in 30 string, when I can say X add, because I want to make sure I add a letter, we don't append to this one. And then I could print out X. It's going to give it to me like this. But now we see that all the repetitive strings are being removed. And then I could turn it back into a string. Well, I could say list to turn this set into a list, so that I can then turn it into a string by utilizing the dot join. And we haven't gone over this yet, so please don't be freaked out if this doesn't make sense. And now we have a clean string. So that's the way sets work. If I try to add multiple, it just won't add it if the value already exists inside of the set. And this is how you start an empty set. If you just put curly brackets when you're trying to start an empty set, you're actually just creating a dictionary that you're adding keys into. So essentially it will work because the dictionary itself will only add the key if it doesn't exist. But you want to make sure you start a set with this function call right here.
Instead of using a for loop, could you just create X after dirty string and then put the variable name dirty string in the set parentheses?
I think you can, yes. And let me move this down. Yeah, so it works the same. And I see the question where you asked about the order. I'm actually kind of curious about it as well, as to why I switched the order. So it seems it switches the order every time I run it.
There's a good chance that set is another unordered data structure, that it doesn't officially maintain order. And usually that's because there's some efficiency gain for not maintaining the order. Like they're just not worried about that. And the idea is like, that's not what a set is for. If you care about order, you want to use an array of some kind or a list. And if you care about just knowing that you have a unique version of everything, then you have a set. But that's kind of, we definitely get into that more in week 3. The whole idea of data structures is like, when do you want to reach for that tool? Because you got a lot of tools in your tool set. Not everyone's appropriate for every problem.
Yeah, and then this is also super useful with numbers, because once you run it with a number, you could always order it when you turn it into a list. And this is just another way of being able to manipulate data. So that is sets. Does anyone have any questions on sets? About removing things from a set, you can use x.delete, or I think it's remove, and then you could remove whatever it is that you want to remove from the set. And you can also use update to be able to make something new or add something new into the set. Okay.
And can you tell us about the intersections also, just two sets, and what's the unique elements and what's the like intersected elements?
One more time about intersects. Yeah, we can.
Intersections.
Yeah. Okay, so we have this intersects, and then you're saying that we could tell it where it is that I want it to intersect, right? Okay, so let's construct a couple of different sets. So let's say set of, and actually let's keep it with Y. Okay, so that will construct a set of numbers. And then let's say we want to do a set of, I'm not sure, we could do characters again. Okay, so now I can say x dot intersection, and then that intersection could be y and z. And then when I print x, we should see all of them combined. So we do see all of them combined, but unfortunately,
Is that right? I would look up the definition because intersection, as far as I know, is
not combined.
like it basically, first of all, is x dot intersection returning something, or is it mutating x? It's unlikely to be mutating x because sets are supposed to be immutable. An intersection would mean where they all overlap, I believe, as opposed to union would mean combining all of them. So yeah, that'll only be the similarities between the sets involved, and so that's probably going to be a much smaller set.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. So now if I print result, now we should see the commonality between a couple of sets.
And it's empty because there's no commonality between dirty string and y because, I mean, besides 8, I guess. And then there's no commonality between the set 8 and just, yeah, now you'll get 8.
Perfect. Does the intersection refer to the same values? So it's looking for the same values inside of all 3 sets that were passed. Does that answer your question, Eric?
Like, if you change a value in the intersection, is it going to change the value in the set, in the original set?
No, so I think Benjamin mentioned that sets are supposed to be immutable. So whatever you do to result, because now result is a set itself that's independent from these other 3. Whatever you do to result would only live inside of result. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Is intersection only for sets, or can you do it for list, strings, etc.? I'm not 100% sure. I actually don't use the intersection method a lot, but we can definitely explore it once we get to the built-in methods. So if you could please remind me, Peter, I would appreciate that.
Yeah, I doubt intersection is directly supported on lists or strings or these other things, but the whole idea is that you can change one form to another. So you can take a string and represent it as a list, take that same string and represent it as a set. And so you could take a string, represent it as a set without losing the original string, and then maybe run some kind of intersection on, you know, the set representing one string and the set representing another. And the idea is like you get to choose the right tool for the right job. Yeah.
Awesome. So now let's go over a little bit about dictionaries. So dictionaries and lists, especially in Python, it's important that we understand how they work because we're going to be, when we're actually creating our applications, we're going to be changing information in lists and dictionaries. So the main difference between dictionaries and objects is that in a dictionary, you have to put your keys inside of quotation marks, whereas in objects, you don't. The other difference is the way you go and call these variables. So in JavaScript, if I were to try to access a key inside of this dictionary, and let's say that key didn't exist, well, JavaScript would just return undefined and continue running. Whereas if I try to do it in Python, Python would freak out and tell me that that doesn't exist. So if I go to print people, and let's say I want to get Alice. Sorry, is there a hot mic, or is that just me?
Nope, that's me. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize I wasn't muted.
No problem at all. All right, so now we got people. We go into 0. And let's say I wanted to get name. Well, I can do name because name exists. And I should see Alice. And let me actually comment out this intersection. Okay, so now I see Alice. But let's say that I wanted to grab something like salary or wage. All right, let's say I do wage. Well, now when I run it, it tells me that there's an error because wage doesn't exist. So when you access things inside of a dictionary, I don't recommend doing it through square brackets. Instead, use the .get method, because when you use the .get method, now if I pass in wage to the .get, instead of breaking my program, it's just going to return none and continue running. Another thing that I can use to .get is I can put a comma and then say, okay, well, if it doesn't exist, then returned doesn't exist. Now, when I run it, instead of returning none, it checked, is wage inside of this dictionary? It isn't. So instead, I'm going to return the second argument that I got asked to return. So now it returns doesn't exist. If I wanted to go ahead and give it a value, I can do set default. And then I can say, okay, well, grab wage if wage exists. And if it doesn't, then give it a value of 25. So when I run this, I should see 25 being printed out. And when I print people at index 0, we'll see that dictionary is updated to where it now has the key of wage with the value of 25. Those are just a couple of different methods to be able to grab information out of a dictionary. I strongly recommend you don't use the same thing that you use in JavaScript, where you put it in square brackets and call the specific key. Because again, if the key doesn't exist, it will just break your program. You don't want something that will break your program to be in there. Try to use either .get or set default.
Yes. So when you're setting up the default, can you do the same way, like saying like if you request something that doesn't exist, it just instead of breaking the code, just says it doesn't exist. That's it.
One more time.
When you set up the default like you did, can you do the same way, same thing, like, you know, just for anything else? Just instead of just wage, you know, if you write down something weight and just return something, this is not, it doesn't exist, something like that, except the throwing error.
Oh, so you're saying the in set default, instead of making the new key, returning something?
Yeah, returning like for everything else which doesn't exist, just returns saying like this doesn't exist. That's it.
Yeah, so you can't do that with set default, but you can definitely do that. You know, set default. Okay, how do I close this? Let's see. Yeah, so you can't do that with set default where you're just telling it to return something, but you can return, you could do that with get, right? Whereas then if I tell it to do get and then try to run something like wage, it's going to return 25.
No, I'm talking about in general. Instead of age, you can put something weight or anything else which doesn't exist. Just everything else, just return this value.
Yes, you can. So let's see, we can do something like a good employee. And then we can make it a Boolean where it says true, right? And now when I go ahead and run it, it's going to return true here because I'm using get, but it's not going to change anything inside of my dictionary. Whereas if I use set default and then I run it, it returns true and then adds it to my dictionary. Is that what you're asking, Islam?
I guess so, yeah. I mean, can you do it for everything else? You know, just instead of just one thing. If it doesn't exist, just return something like, you know.
Oh, okay. I think I
Okay.
understand what you're saying. So like if I were to iterate through the dictionary and then grab each individual key.
Yeah, if key doesn't exist, it just returns like default value.
Yeah. So in people index 0. Well, this will actually just give me all of the keys inside of the dictionary. But yes, essentially, you're asking me a yes or no question, and the answer is yes. I'm not sure how I could demonstrate it, but you could pass any type of key in there. And if it doesn't exist, it's going to return to you something that's not something else if you pass it on the second argument. So wage only be set for people 0, not all. Could you add it to all by doing people dot set default? So for Katie's answer, no, I cannot, because what you're asking for setting it for all people, I would actually have to iterate through the entire list, because this itself isn't a dictionary, it's a list of dictionaries. So I can iterate through people. So I can say for person in people, and then say person dot set default, and then I can say good employee, and then set it to true. And let's say that good employee here is already existing, and I'll set it to false here. All right, so it's going to grab it or give it the new value. And now I can go ahead and print people. Now, when I run it, we see that I have name, Alice, and Alice, she's a good employee. Bob, when I get to good employee, he's false, because I checked, does this key exist? And because that key already existed, it did not give it a default value. Instead, it left it alone. And then it moved on to Carol, where the key did not exist. So it gave it the value, the key pair value of good employee and true. Does that answer your question, Katie? Okay, of course. And then Grace, how do you avoid accidentally mixing up your languages when coding, or does that just come with practice and time? It honestly just comes with practice and time. The more you do it, the more it's just going to start blending in together, or you'll just be able to realize. I mean, you guys saw me do it at the beginning of the lesson, and you know, just recognize the errors, make a couple of syntax adjustments, and then just keep trucking. Awesome. So we're at 7:56. We've been making pretty good headway, and we're about to start with functions and if statements. So let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break and come back at 10:05. All right. I'll see everybody in 10 minutes. All right. Moving on to functions. Well, functions kind of work the same as they do in JavaScript. The difference is that in JavaScript, I have a couple of different ways to be able to establish a function. So then I can do name, and I can make this an arrow function, right? Or I can explicitly tell JavaScript, hey, this is a function, name, it's going to take in this as many arguments, and here's my body. Well, with Python, the only way to establish a function is by using the EEF keyword. And the DEF stands for define, meaning that I am defining a function. And as we know, a function is just basically blocks of code that I can ensure happen for every single thing inside of my list, or in multiple places in a dictionary, or in my Python file. So let's say I want a function that says, well, I want to build a full name. Build full name. Okay. And I want this function to take in first name. And I also want it to take in last name. Okay. Well, now what I can do is I can then return a function, or I can return a name of interpolated string, where I can just say first name and last name. So now let's say that I have a list, right? And in this list, I have a list of names. So list of names. And I make that equal to a list. And now inside of this list of names, I have other lists that have a first name. So let's say Francisco. And let's say Avila. Okay, that didn't clean it up the way I hoped it would. Okay, let's say we have Ben, and I can't remember what his last name is, so I'm going to go with Co. And let's say we have Nick, whose last name I also don't remember, but let's say we'll just put last, and so on. Okay, and then let me just open this up so it's a little bit more readable for everybody. Okay, so now I have a list of 3 lists that have a first name and a last name. And let's say I wanted to see this function for every single list that has a first name and a last name. Well, now I can iterate through it for person in list of names. And then I can print, call the function, build full name, and then pass in person index 0, since that will be the first name, and pass in person 1, which would be the last name. So now when I run this, interesting. Person index 0, gr, person in list of names. There is something going on up here, isn't there? There you go. Got it. I used the wrong variable. So there's a list of name at the very top, and what we established was list of names, and that's where that problem was coming from. So let me run a clear here eventually. Okay. And now we can see it print out the names. We wanted Francisco Avila, Bencio, and Nick last. Okay. So I built out this function that I knew that I was going to need in order to create my first names, or my names all completed from this list of names. That's basically how functions work. It does go over something like keywords and kwargs. So let's try to cover that real quick. So the order matters for positional arguments, right? If I were to switch these two around, and let's say that I wanted, if I were to switch these two around, like I was saying, well, now when I run this, it's still going to give me the same, it's going to give me the wrong output now, because I'm telling it to put last name at the end of my interpolated string and the first name at the beginning. I can also give it a default value. So let's say, oh, and let me switch these back around. Okay, so let's say that one of my members didn't have a last name, or that it could be possible that I don't have a last name for every single one of them. Well, maybe I could do something like, doesn't exist. Okay, and now let's say that I remove this first argument from here, and I were to send it. When I get all of the first names still, I didn't pass a second argument, but because I gave it a default value, my program doesn't break, and instead it gives it the default value that I provided. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, perfect. So moving on, we move into kwargs. Okay, so we got, well, first we're going to move into args, and then we'll move into kwargs. So here we go. Let's do it where I'm just going to go ahead and erase all of this. And I'm just going to do star args. Okay, and now what I want to do is I want to return args altogether. Promise I can spell. Well, now when I run this, I get these tuples, right? And these tuples have all of the information that I was able to pass in. It was able to grab, okay, well, this is the first name. And if I bring back that person at index 1 and I run it, well, I get all the arguments that were passed in inside of an argument. Okay, so this is great. So now instead what I can do is, let's say that I wanted, again, to build that last name. I can say it's already in a return. So I can say args at index 0. And then say args at index 1. And we still get the same result, but now I made it a little bit more flexible to where it's only looking for args0 and args1. The problem with this, though, is that if I were to take off the person 1 and run it this way, well, now it's going to give me an error because it's looking for an argument at position 1 for every tuple, but there isn't a second argument. And I wasn't able to give it a default value, so it just failed on me. So just be careful with that with args whenever you decide to use it or if not to use it. Okay, and then we have star kwargs. So let's try to get a handle on star kwargs. All right, so when I pass this, now when I pass this in, I can say person and person index 1. And let's just return kwargs so we can see what it looks like.
You wrote kwargs instead of kwargs.
Thank you. So 1, build full name, take 0 positional arguments, but 2 were given. Interesting. Starts with kwargs, used. I'll have to figure this kwargs out part for us and then get back to us right after our break. So I'll leave this kwargs part for after our break. I apologize, everybody. Okay, so now to continue pushing forward, we got this if statement portion. So let's build this back to our positional argument where we got, I think that's the unpacking operator for dictionaries. Yes, it is. So typically the way, here, I'll bring it back. Typically the way I've used kwargs before is instead of doing it this way, well, what this dictionary would look like it would have, so first name, let's see. Okay, and then we have last name. I have to change these manually, so let's do that. Okay, so now I have my first name and last name. Well, I can return kwargs, and let's see what it will do if I pass it this way. Fill full name, take source. Take 0 positional arguments.
So I may have missed something, but how were you able to put in that text to all 3 of those at the same time under that list?
Oh, here?
Yes.
So I can highlight whatever the commonality is that I want to look for, right? So in this case, it's going to highlight all the instances where I have first name. And then I'm on a Mac, so I use Command D. I think for Windows users is Control D. And it's just going to create multi-cursors for every single one of them. And then if you hold down Command or Control and then use the arrow keys to the left, it's gonna go to the furthest left side where there's text. And if you go right, it goes to the furthest right side. I left some empty spaces, which I shouldn't have, and that's the reason why mine does that. So if I erase those empty spaces, and now I do it. Well, now I did one on top as well because I went too fast. But now we see my cursor goes to the very end. Does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Of course, no problem. Why is the star kwargs not working out? DF. Oh, that's why. Interesting. So it's the way I'm passing it in. It's incorrectly. So I would say first name is equal to, and in this case, it would have been person 0. But now since I'm passing it the way I am, it would be person dot get first name. And then the second argument would be last name, which again would be equal to person dot get and then last name. And let me try to clean this up a little bit so that it's more readable to everybody. I didn't close this function out. Okay, so there's my print being closed off, and there's my function being closed off. Okay, so now we can see it. And let me see if that cleared up our problem real quick. Okay, so now I said that it doesn't match because I'm trying to grab first name, and that's because I am doing it wrong. I believe so. Let's see. Yeah, if I can't get it right this time, we'll have to go ahead and address this after the break because I don't want to waste your guys' time, to be fully honest. Okay, so it's able to grab the kwargs now. So we see that it's in first name. Okay. So maybe I have to use the .get method and grab it for first name. There you go. So now it's working. Again, I apologize for the inconvenience. So now we have kwargs, and now I can get it again, kwargs. So now we saw that kwargs basically just built a dictionary for us, and now we can grab the data from kwargs as such. Kwargs.get last name. Okay. But if I do it this way, it starts getting mad now. It's weird because when I do it outside of here, it looks like you can't do string interpolation that way. And that's kwargs. I'll make sure to get everybody a better tutorial on kwargs later on. Again, I apologize for that. All right, so moving forward, let's bring back these two variables that I had. So we had F name, and let's go into L name. And let's just build this dictionary back to what it was, where it was essentially just taking in a list, or actually, let's leave it the way we have it for now. And let's just pass in these two arguments like this. Okay, so I'm passing the first name and the last name. No need to worry about kwargs. I know in the end state, I want to return something like F name and last name. But currently the way this is working, I could pass anything into this specific dictionary, into this specific function, and it would still run. But I only want this function to work if I'm passing in names, which are string types. So now I can run into my if statements to be able to control this behavior. So I can check if both of them are strings. So to build this if, and I want both conditions to be true, would I be using an and or an or inside of this if statement?
And.
Yeah, I say and as well.
Perfect. So then I would say if type F name is equal to string type and last name. So here's the difference between the ands and the or. In JavaScript, you have to do the double ampersand or the the straight brackets. I would assume that's what they're called.
Pipe.
Right. Whereas in here in Python, we actually just write it in plain English where it's and or just a flat or. Perfect. So now let's go ahead and put this in type. And let's make that equal to a string as well. So I only want this behavior if both of the things that I'm passing into it are in string types. Otherwise, so else, I want it to return invalid entry. Okay, so now let's say that I make a new entry where I say first name is true and my last name is a 5. Okay. Now when I run this, we see that last argument that was passed just came back as an invalid entry because it checked, okay, well, this is a Boolean variable, it's not a string, so we're going to automatically go into our else statement and return that this is an invalid entry. Okay. Awesome. And this is actually a pretty good time to go into try and accept blocks before continuing on forward, which it seems try and accept blocks are a little bit further down. So let's try to run over try and accept blocks here. So I have this function that I have it to built out to be able to run the way that I want it to run. Okay, so this is great. But now I can say, I want you to try something. And then if it's not working, what I'm telling you to do, then just completely avoid it. And actually, now that I'm looking at it in retrospect, this may not be a good example. We can more than likely attack it later on. That way we can ensure that we have everything else in a good set stone place. So let's move forward. And the next part that we have is for loops. Now for loops, try and accept, it is like try and catch with JavaScript. Yes, that is correct, Jonathan. All right, so let's go into for loops. And there is quite a different way of doing for loops. And let me actually scroll up here. We have all the other data types already. So a number, you can't iterate through a number. So if I say 4, 3, 4, 5, and then I try to say for num in a small number, and then I try to say print num, when I run my Python code, it's going to give me a problem saying that the integer object is not iterable. And it would be the same thing if I try to turn it into a float. So a float number, just in case we haven't covered it, is anything that has a decimal. So when I run it, it's going to tell me, okay, well, float isn't iterable either. Perfect. So now that covers how to iterate through numbers. We would actually have to turn it into a string to be able to iterate through that. So let's go over iterating through a string real quick. All right, so strings are also immutable, meaning I cannot mutate them. I can't grab the index of E and try to give it a new value. It would fail. So, but I can actually iterate through greeting itself. So let's try to iterate through person. I could say for letter in person, and I can say print letter. Well, when I clear this and I run it, it's going to print each individual letter. All right, so this is more of a for in type of loop. And now let's say that I wanted to do it by index, and I wanted to grab the individual indexes of the letter. Well, in JavaScript, we have a for I loop where I can tell it to mimic the length of whatever object it is that I'm trying to do. And in Python, we're actually going to have to use a function called range. So let me demonstrate what range does here. When I print range 5, it's going to tell me basically what the function is. But if I want to see what the function is doing under the hood, I have to cast it into a list just so that I can visualize it. So let's run this real quick. And I see that the two arguments that I passed into it were 0 and 5. Now notice I only passed one argument. It was 5. So it's assuming that if I don't pass a first and second argument, that I'm telling it to start from 0. And then also notice that the number 5 is not included in my list down here. It's because this function is exclusive, meaning that it doesn't include the argument that I pass into it. So if I wanted to do something that went from 1 through 5 and didn't include the 0, well, then I would have to do 1, 6. And now when I run this, I can actually get the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 as running it in range. Okay, so now back to the for loops. I can say for, I think index this time. So I'm going to go ahead and say IDX in range. And I want to grab the length of the value. In this case, it will be person. So len is the equivalent of dot length. And now I can say print person at IDX. And we could even print IDX just so we can see it. All right, so now we could see we have the index, and we also have what that index value is representing inside of the string. All right, so at index 1, we have A, and so on, all the way until index 12, where we have the N. Okay, so that's another way of doing this, this looping. We can also do this looping with a different function called enumerate. And what enumerate does is that common to use IDX instead of I. So it's really up to you what you use. I try to use as descriptive as possible, and I recommend that you guys do as well, especially when you're starting out. Try to utilize IDX just so that you know that what you're iterating through is an index. I've seen students code before where they use I for almost everything, and then we're inside of one of their blocks of code, and it's like maybe 25, 30 lines of code, and ask them, okay, well, what's I representing? And they have no idea what I is representing anymore because they used it so many times throughout their loops. So just try to be descriptive over what it is that you're iterating over. In this case, I use IDX just so that I know it is an index. Is there a for of in Python? Not to my knowledge, but let me check. So we got Python for loops, for in, for in, for in. Yeah, from what I know, there's only 4 in loops. Okay, let's move into enumerate here. And enumerate actually does this thing where it's going to deconstruct what it is that I'm going through or iterating through and give me 2 separate things that I can call. So I'm going to call the index and the value here. And in this enumerate function, I'm going to pass the person. I believe that's his name. Yep, person. And now I can print IDX and value. And it does the same thing as the range loop, just in a little bit of a shorter hand. Right? Gives me all of the indexes along with their values. Okay. So that's iterating through strings. Let's go over iterating through loops. Through list. When you iterate through a list, well, lists work a bit differently because when you work through a list, I can actually do variable reassignment, but I can't do it to the specific value. So here's what I mean by that. So for company in, what did I call this list again? And let me try to minimize this. List of names. And say print company. Okay, and we see that when I ran this code, it was actually able to give me grape, tomato, cucumber, et cetera, and it gave me the rest of the array. Okay, well now let's say that if it's tomato, I want to change it to apple, right? So I can do an if statement that says, if company, is there an advantage using enumerate over the range in loop? So the range in loop gives you the advantage that you can reverse it if need to be. And I could actually demonstrate that real quick. I'll do it here shortly. But other than that, there's really no advantage. I guess you could consider memory space and efficiency. Then in that case, you could use range rather than enumerate. But it's really not going to make that big of a difference. Does that answer your question, Jonathan? Okay, perfect. All right, so if company is equal to, I think we said tomato and we wanted to change it to apple, well, I could try to say make company equal to apple. And then I can try to print this list of names, and I would expect to see a difference. But when I run this, we see that tomato stayed. It never went away. No variable reassignment happened, but it also didn't throw an error. Okay, well, instead what I can do is I can use the enumerate function again, pass in the list of names, and then let's say I pass in the index and the company, and then I can say if company, because I'm still grabbing the value, and say, is that equal to tomato? Well, if it is, then list of names at the index is equal to apple. And now if I run that, we can see that apple has replaced tomato because I did variable reassignment to the list, not the string itself. Does that make sense to everyone? Awesome. Am I losing you guys? I know it's a lot of dry information. I'll try to move a little bit faster. That way I don't lose the class. All right, so we got IDX, enumerate. We went over the different ways to loop both through list and strings. So now let's go over. Yeah, it is a considerable amount of information, I know. Let's go over how to iterate through a dictionary. How could I do this? Let's see. Let's grab this one. My employee. Okay, so now we have Alice as our employee. And we want to make sure that, okay, try to create a tuple for me, and that's because I left a comma. Okay, so now we have Alice, an employee, and let's say I wanted to iterate through all the items inside of Alice. Well, I can say for key in my employee, and then I could print the key. And by doing that, I would get the key of each individual key value pair inside of my dictionary. Okay, what if I just wanted the value? Well, I can say for val in dot values, my employee dot values, and then I can print val. And that will give me all of the values inside of my dictionary. Well, now what if I wanted both? Well, if I want both, I can send items and I can deconstruct it where I can grab the key and the value, and then I could print out the key and value. This way, if I need to give it, if I can need to check a value and then give that specific key a new value of that value doesn't meet a specific condition, I already have the key and the value for me to be able to do any type of data manipulation. Awesome. I noticed that MDN Web Docs doesn't have any info for Python. Anyone know a similar resource for Python? I can definitely shoot out a couple of good resources. It will be, I will send that out immediately after class. We also have a resources section at the very bottom of our README. Okay, so now we went over for loops, and then we have while loops. So while loops work exactly like they do in JavaScript. The only difference is that we're not using parentheses or curly brackets. We just use indentation. So let's say counter is equal to 5. And let's say while 5 is greater than 0, then I want you to print 5 And then afterwards, I want you to print takeoff. Oh, and I forgot to decrement, so I got stuck in an infinite loop. So let's do counter minus equals 1. Interesting.
Yeah, you have to check
You're
while
saying
too.
while 5 is greater than 0. I think you should do while counter is greater than 0.
Yep, definitely. Thank you so much. All right, so I was getting stuck in an infinite loop because I wasn't calling my variable, but it doesn't seem. Oh, because I'm telling it to print 5 instead of counter. Look at that. I'm losing my mind as well. Maybe it's time for a break again, huh? All right, so now we see 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1, and we have this left over from the iteration up top. So let me comment that out real quick. Okay, so while loops would need a counter, but with the for loops, it's not necessary, like I++. Right, with our for loops, it's not necessary because we're not necessarily establishing a conditional where I'm saying while I is less than whatever it is, then do this information. Instead, we're just doing a straight linear across the entire possible indexes inside of that element. Does that make sense, Dave? Thanks. Yeah, of course. There are no do while loops in Python. I'm assuming this is in reference to a separate language. But I believe the while loop technically mimics the same thing as the do while. Is that correct, Eric? And please correct me if I'm wrong.
Right. I think the do while loop, it'll execute it at least once before checking the condition.
No, but Python does not have the equivalent of that.
Okay.
And no, Python does not have a simplified increment like plus plus or minus minus. You have to use this minus equals, which I think I utilized here. Minus equals or plus equals, which is, I'm pretty sure, exactly what both Jesse and Bennett said. So thank you for supporting me in the chat. All right, and now we have built-in methods. We're almost there. Built-in methods, here we go. Okay, let's try to at least go through all of the string built-in methods before we go out for another break. And then after that, we'll reconsolidate and go through the rest of them. Okay, so integer, string, here you go. And then we'll just work with this one specifically. I'm gonna go ahead and bring it down to the bottom. All right, so now we have our person, and we wanna work with our person to be able to make a couple of different things. Well, I can say print person dot capitalize. And here we can see that when I run this, it's just gonna capitalize the very first letter. If I wanted to capitalize all of them, I can say go to upper. Now when I run this, it turns the entire string into uppercase letters. I also have this title function. And this title function, well, it capitalizes the first letter of every word inside. And then we have this replace function that's actually really useful. We've talked about cleaning up strings. A common problem that I've seen a couple of times now, it goes somewhere along the lines of, okay, well, given a number, I want you to take out all the zeros from this number and return an integer, right? So let's say that I have something like the number of 1001, well, it would expect me to return 11. So if I needed to fix this, what I can say is I can print. So I know I'm going to have to cast it into an integer towards the end, but first I need it to be a string so that it has this function. So I need it to be 1001 dot replace. And then replace takes in two variables. So one, what the old value is, which will be a 0. And then the second parameter would be what I want it to be replaced with. So I'm going to turn 1001 into a string, and I'm going to replace all the zeros with nothing. And then I'm going to cast that back into an integer, turning it into 11. So if you ever get a problem where you have to clean up some sort of number, you want to cast it into a string, use the replace function, and then cast it back into an integer. And then you could also do all that casting here inside of the same line. But the replace functionality is actually really powerful, and you could utilize it with string and string only. Okay, let's see. Oh, wow, this really doesn't go over a lot of things inside of built-in methods. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and go over the list built-in methods before we continue moving forward. We'll just keep utilizing this list real quick. Let me see how we're doing on time. Okay, we're good on time. All right, so list of names. Let's say that I wanted to add something to the list of names. Well, I can just say append and put something. And then I can print list of names here so that we can see something is now at the end of my list. That is how I append something towards the end. If I wanted to find something inside of my, let's say I just wanted the index, right? Well, I can do index, and let's say I wanted the index of tomato. Well, I can just print this. And now we see that it returns to me the index where tomato is located. And what's actually happening in this function